Ukraine is the Paris Hilton of countries. Anytime it's in the news, it's not for anything good. In the last few decades, Ukraine has been the scene of the worst nuclear catastrophe in history, a military conflict with Russia, and the biggest corruption scandals that you could ever imagine. But look, there's another thing Ukrainian politicians have in common with Paris Hilton. They both have a lot of money. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Ukraine's economy stopped being managed by the state and started being managed by the state's friends. These are the so-called oligarchs, and you can find them in all of the country's political parties, whether they're pro-Russia or anti-Russia.
So for example, the current president, Petro Poroshenko, is known as the King of Chocolate because he owns the biggest chocolate company in the country. And the former president, Yulia Tymoshenko, is known as the gas princess because she made a lot of money in the gas industry. So in other words, the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Nonetheless, they are really starting to change in Ukraine, but do make no mistake, these changes, they are not for the better. In fact, rather the opposite is true. You see, in a previous video, we told you how Russia is Europe's main gas provider. For example, Germany buys 60% of their natural gas from Russian companies like Gazprom and Rosneft. And how does this gas arrive? Well, most of it comes from gas pipelines that cross Ukrainian soil. Well, so what does all of this mean? Well, it means that despite Ukraine having little gas resources, they are still a hotspot in this business. And this is where Vladimir Putin enters the picture. To this day, Putin needs Ukraine to supply Europe with gas. But as you know, the relationship between Putin and Kiev currently has a status of it's complicated, to rather say the least. So, after decades of love and Slavic fraternity, the government of Ukrainian President Poroshenko wants to stay away from Putin as much as possible. As you can imagine, this political divorce, it's not exactly making Russia happy. Anytime their gas goes through Ukrainian territory, they have to pay a millionaire's share of alimony to their ex-wife. But this is not the end of our story. As long as Ukraine is the center of the key gas routes, Kiev will have a better position to negotiate with Moscow and even with Brussels. In other words, Ukraine matters as long as we need them for gas. Alright, so what is Putin's strategy? Well, check this out.
Russians insist on new pipeline to bypass Ukraine, and Europeans are fine with it.
Yes, dear viewers, Russia wants to take Ukraine out of that gas route equation. This way, Ukraine would lose their strategic value, which would also mean that neither America nor the European Union would really care about them in the case of a new Russian invasion. So the question is, well, can this strategy actually work? Will the European Union let Russia bypass Ukraine? Well, today we are going to answer all of these questions, but as we always do, let's take a look back at the history.
If you're not mine, then you won't be anyone else's.
In the year 2000, 70% of the Russian gas arriving from Europe came from Ukraine. More specifically, it came from the so-called Brotherhood gas pipeline. This pipeline was built in the times of the Soviet Union, and it became more important as the demand for Russian gas grew. The other 30% came from the Yamal pipe in Belarus, but that's a story for another day. When the Soviet Union fell apart, Ukraine became an independent nation. And this was the moment when key politicians in Kiev started to see the business clearly. They basically thought, well, Russia has the gas reserves, but they need to sell to us to get to the Germans, so they should pay us a fare. That seems fair. Nowadays, this fare is still more than $2 billion a year, but it used to be even higher. Thanks to the so-called transit right, this state-owned Ukrainian gas company called Naftogas became an absolute behemoth, and all of this with basically having no gas resources in their own country. As you can imagine, this isn't just about economics. Both in Russia and Ukraine, everything's a political weapon. So anytime Kiev had a Russian-friendly government, Gazprom sold them cheap gas. But when Kiev didn't have Russian-friendly politicians in office, well, the prices went sky high. We actually already discussed this in another video, the first one in this series on Russian gas. The gas negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, they led to a supply cut in 2000 and 2009. In 2009, this actually caused the rest of Europe to go without gas as well. And this was when Russia started a new strategy. Putin picked up the phone to his friend, who used to be the German Chancellor and is now the president of Rosneft. His name is Gerhard Schröder, and Gerhard Schröder, he phones the current German Chancellor, and that's of course Angela Merkel. This is how they sold them on the first project to bypass Ukraine, and that's the Nordstream 1 pipeline. This pipeline goes straight through the Baltic Sea from Russia direct to Germany. 1 year later, in 2010, Yanukovych won the Ukrainian policy. Yanukovych is a pro-Russian politician. So the good times and the cheap gas, well, it came back. But in 2014, we had the Euromaidan. Do you remember those protests in Kiev? Well, they took Yanukovych out of office and brought a brand new anti-Russian government to Ukraine. And this is where Putin essentially said, if I can't have you, nobody can.
Since 2015, Gazprom, the main Russian gas company, started the ultimate plan to bypass Ukraine. On the one hand, they started Nord Stream 2 through the Baltic. And on the other hand, on the southern side, Gazprom is building the Turkstream that sends gas through the Black Sea to Turkey. According to the Gazprom president, by the year 2020, the good old Brotherhood pipeline will carry less than 10% of what it used to carry.
But hold on a second, because so far it just seems like Russia is just plain bad and Ukraine is just a poor victim here, right? Well, in fact, things are way more complicated than that, so should we dive a little deeper maybe?
The Ukrainian Juggernaut.
Naftogas is far more than a gas company. In fact, it's kind of a job agency. They have more than 175,000 workers. To put that in some perspective, by the way, the National Gas Company of Poland, which is also owned by the state, only employs 25,000 people. In other words, in Ukraine, you're nobody if you don't have a relative who works for Naftogas. As you can imagine, Naftogas is a black hole on Ukraine's finances. It's sort of like if Paris Hilton was doing her own accounting. With so many people working for a state-owned enterprise, money disappears and nobody knows why. According to the Institute for European Research and Policy Consulting, a Ukrainian think tank, Naftogas loses more than $3 billion a year from corruption. This company is always reporting financial losses, and we aren't talking about a little bit of money here. Just in 2014, Naftogas losses accounted for 6% of the entire Ukrainian GDP. But right then in 2014, we had the Euromaidan, and this meant very fast changes like this one.
Damn. Ukrainian police detains Naftogas chairman of board, Yevhen Bakulin.
The new CEO of the company is this man you see on the screen now, Andriy Koboyev, a 40-year-old consultant. His job could be summarized in two goals: ending corruption and ending Russian dependency. And now you might wonder, well, is he actually serious about this? Well, so far things actually look kind of good. Both the European Union and the IMF have pushed Ukraine to do their homework, and it seems like they're actually trying.
GSE announces new improvements of the Storage Transparency Initiative. Naftogas of Ukraine joins Gas Storage Inventory, AGSI+.
Since then, Naftogas has started to make a profit. After decades of losses, they now account for 13% of the state's income. And now you might be wondering, well, what did Koboyev do? Was he the magic formula? First of all, as is always the case with state monopolies, the prices were controlled by the government. This means really cheap gas and Ukrainian consumers who are used to paying these artificially low prices. Now Naftogas has raised prices to a level equal to that of other European countries. Second of all, Koboyev has confronted Putin with a lot of, let's call it, lateral thinking. You see, Gazprom wanted to raise gas prices for Ukraine, but not for the rest of the European countries. So what did Ukraine do? Instead of fighting with Moscow, they started to buy gas from other European countries, like Slovakia. But hold on a minute, because you might be thinking now, well, does Slovakia actually have gas resources? I've never heard of that. And no, they don't. But here's what happened.
The contracts with Gazprom say that once the gas arrives in an EU country, Russia loses control over it. This means that the buyer can do whatever they want with the gas once it shows up. So Slovakia gets their Russian gas through the Brotherhood pipe, and then it sends it back through the same pipe to Ukraine. So Slovakia buys Russian gas, and then Ukraine buys it from Slovakia. Thanks to this, Naftogas has cut their importing costs by a quarter.
But this is just the beginning. Koboyev keeps looking for alternatives. For example, he's looking to Azerbaijan. As we said in other videos, Azerbaijan has lots of gas. They are indeed building a pipeline, the Trans-Anatolian, which goes to Italy. Kiev wants to connect to this pipe through Bulgaria, but this is going to be something that we're going to dig into in a future video. Because believe me, Azerbaijan is another interesting topic that deserves a video all of its own. If you don't want to miss that, well, don't forget to subscribe. So let's go back to our story. It seems that Ukraine is doing a great job cleaning up corruption, right? Well, hold on a minute, because as we always say on VisualPolitik, not everything is sunshine and rainbows. If Ukraine wants to fully adapt to European standards, they should liberalize their gas market. This would mean that Naftogas would no longer be a monopoly, and they would have to split up the company into several smaller companies. One would be focused on gas production, another would manage domestic consumption, and so on and so forth. As you can imagine, this is where some problems are gonna come into the picture.
EU and Ukraine in tug-of-war over Naftogas unbundling.
As you can imagine, as much as Koboyev wants to clean up the company, too many oligarchs have been too good to the company for too long. Now, the company might be owned by the state, but this is not a reason not to have millionaire salaries and millionaire bribes, right? And the reality is this is something that is really hard to stop overnight. But this isn't the worst part. You see, in March of 2019, Ukraine, they're going to have elections again, and the result is going to be decisive for Naftogas's future. And as you might imagine, dear viewer, Russia do have a well-defined agenda for this, so let's have a look at it.
Economics versus geopolitics.
Germany has made it all clear. They will build the Nordstream 2 pipeline. Both Brussels and Washington are against it. In fact, Donald Trump has been the biggest critic. He essentially said that even Paris Hilton would do a better job than Germany when it comes to having good energy policies. And now you might be wondering, well, how is it possible that Angela Merkel has let herself be seduced by Vladimir Putin? Yes, I mean, you know that the former German Chancellor, Gerhard Schröder, is Putin's man in Europe, but there's a lot more to it than that. The basic situation is Germany have a big dilemma. On one hand, their industry needs gas, and a lot of it. The safer and cheaper and cleaner it is, the better. And putting politics aside, Nord Stream 2 is the best option for their economy. It's cheap and it avoids gas wars with Ukraine. The problem is that this gas pipeline would make Germany even more dependent on Russia. Meanwhile, Putin's pretty happy. He can bypass the Ukraine and he can also destroy their economy. In this regard, Russia's intentions are pretty darn obvious about this. So you want an example of that? Well, take a look at this map. This is the Black Sea, and this little sea to the north is the Azov Sea. Both seas are connected by the Kerch Strait. And Ukraine, they've got two important harbors in the Azov Sea. So what did Russia do? Well, they built a bridge right at the Kerch Strait, a bridge that makes most of the ships unable to arrive or leave the Azov Sea. This is why you hear so much on the news about military escalation in this region. So now you might be wondering, well, why is Russia trying to bankrupt Ukraine? Is it all about jealousy? No, absolutely not. The thing is, the worse the anti-Russian Ukrainian government does, the better things are for the pro-Russian candidates in the elections. And are there any pro-Russian candidates running in the 2019 Ukrainian elections? Well, the answer is, well, yeah, anything's pretty much possible. Here's an example of how crazy this country can be. In Ukraine, they have this TV show called Servant of the People. The star is a teacher who fights corruption. And here's the thing, there's an actual political party that is based on this television series. The actor who plays the role of the teacher is actually the candidate. His name is Vladimir Zelensky, and, well, does he have any chance of winning? Well, have a look at this.
Timoshenko leading presidential candidate poll, followed by Poroshenko, Zelensky, and Hirtsenko.
Yep, you heard that right. He is in third place, followed by the King of Chocolate and the Gas Princess. So essentially, it's pretty much impossible to predict what's actually going to happen. There is just one thing that is clear in this story, and that's that Azerbaijan is already having a really good time. We're going to talk about that in the next video, but in the meantime, the question for you is, well, what would you do if you were Germany? Would you take that cheap Russian gas in exchange for leaving Ukraine alone, or would you sacrifice competitiveness for political interest? Well, please leave your answer in the comment section below. Also, do visit reconsidermedia.com, the podcast that provided the vocals in this episode that were not mine. Also, if you liked this video, give us a thumbs up. And as always, I'll see you next time.
And if you want to learn more about politics and hear even more of my lovely voice, you can join us at Reconsider Media. We have a podcast at reconsidermedia.com/podcast. See you there.